In 1862, amid the rolling hills of Tennessee, a farmer in his 50s picked up a rifle and went to war. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even aligned to either side, neither a Unionist or a Confederate. But what he did during the Civil War terrified an entire army and carved his name into the bloody folklore of American history. His name was Jack Hinson, and he had no interest in war until war came crashing onto his home. He became a legend. An unassuming man turned into one of the deadliest snipers the Civil War would ever know. This is not just a story of war and gunfire. It's a story of a man, his loss, his resolve, and his transformation. Jack Hinson was in his late 50s when the American Civil War began. As a prosperous farmer who owned a plantation, he also owned plenty of enslaved people, but he was determined to remain neutral. Old Jack's plantation stretched out across 1,200 acres in Stewart County, near the village of Dover along the border between Tennessee and neighboring Kentucky. The Hinson plantation was called Bubbling Springs, which paints a vivid picture of a lush landscape of green grass and clear blue water, perhaps dotted with willow trees and reed beds. It was encircled by woodland and sandwiched between the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. By all accounts, it was a pretty remote place, quiet and away from the hustle and bustle of towns and cities. Hinson was not an imposing man. He was of short stature with long arms and uninspiring gray eyes. He was, however, an intelligent and pragmatic person. When the war came, Hinson made friends on both sides, including Union Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant, future President of the United States, and Confederate Major Charles W. Anderson. He hoped that by making himself appear harmless but amicable, he would be left alone. Although his eldest son joined the Confederacy, Hinson did his best to stay out of politics. In fact, in the summer of 1862, he emancipated the enslaved people working on his plantation. It was probably a decision based on the direction Hinson thought the war was going, rather than a moral one. But it demonstrates that he was not a passionate Confederate like many other plantation owners in the South. But for all he tried not to let politics interfere with his life, Hinson lived in a region that was fiercely contested by the North and the South, and he and his family were caught in the crosshairs. By the fall of 1862, Union troops had an increasingly solid presence in Tennessee, and many locals were not happy about it. Even those who had not joined the Confederate Army were determined to be thorns in the sides of the Unionists. They would ambush soldiers from hiding places in the woods, earning them the nickname bushwhackers. These were guerrilla fighters who didn't obey the normal rules and conventions of war, so the Union Army was keen to get rid of them and to deter any other resentful locals from taking up arms in support of the Confederacy. And so the Union decided to give the bushwhackers a taste of their own medicine. All the rules went out the window, and many officers began killing any who they suspected to be bushwhackers on sight. This is how the tragedy that transformed old Jack Hinson from a mild-mannered farmer into a terrifying sniper began. Hinson was the proud father of as many as 10 children, including 3 sons. His eldest, William, had joined the Confederacy when the war broke out, but the others, George and John, remained home to help on the farm. George was 22, and John had just turned 17. George was skilled with a rifle, and he'd often take his younger brother out into the woods for an afternoon of game hunting. But one day, after they went out with the hope of shooting a deer, the Hinson boys did not come back. While in the woods near Bubbling Springs, they ran into a patrol of the 5th Iowa Cavalry. The soldiers took one look at the 2 young men with rifles and assumed they were bushwhackers, despite George and John telling them over and over again that they were innocent, that they were just hunting so they could help put food on the table. They were tied to a tree and shot. The Union commander, whose name has been lost to history, sought vengeance for the comrades he lost in guerrilla attacks, and wanted to make an example of these supposed bushwhackers. The Union commander, whose name has been lost to history, sought vengeance for the comrades he lost in guerrilla attacks, and wanted to make an example of these supposed bushwhackers. But killing them without giving them a trial wasn't enough. Both Hinson boys were decapitated, and their heads were grotesquely displayed atop the gateposts of the family farm. It was a warning to any other would-be bushwhackers and Confederate sympathizers, even if George and John were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. History does not record what Jack Hinson's reaction was to seeing what the Union patrol had done to his children. We can only imagine the horror and despair he must have felt. He had tried so hard to remain neutral, but now the Union had committed an atrocity against his sons, his home, and his bloodline. In doing so, they inadvertently awakened something darker than they could ever have imagined. Hinson is said to have remained unnervingly calm in the days that followed. Neighbors whispered about him, wondering how a man could endure such tragedy without falling into despair. He maintained composure long enough to bury what was left of his sons, but all the while, he was plotting his revenge. Secretly, Hinson commissioned a rifle. As a man who only ever used a gun to hunt, it was unlike anything he had ever owned. The gunsmith fashioned Hinson a heavy-barreled sniper's rifle, with a long barrel that was carefully tuned for accuracy rather than the speed of loading. At almost double the weight of the most popular rifle of the day, the Springfield, it was an imposing weapon, and the great weight reduced the risk from the charge of powder, steadying it for more deadly precision. Its massive bore fired a 50-caliber bullet, and its effective range far exceeded the standard muskets carried by both Union and Confederate soldiers. Where the average soldier might hope to hit a target at 100 yards, Hinson's weapon could kill a man at 700 yards. Hinson's choice of targets was deliberate. He made no attempt to slaughter indiscriminately. He did not pile into Confederate ranks, nor did he raid Union supply trains. Instead, he aimed for officers, leaders, the men responsible for giving orders, just like the unnamed Union commander who gave the order to execute Hinson's sons. He would lie in wait, sometimes for hours, concealed in the woods or rocks, studying troop movements. Hinson had lived more than 5 decades. He knew the woods, the hills, the bends of the Tennessee River like the back of his hand. He had hunted deer, turkey, and bear. He wasn't a soldier by any stretch of the imagination, but with a rifle in his hands, he was a predator. Of course, his first targets were the men of the patrol who had killed his sons. He picked them all off with terrifying efficiency. One of his favorite targets after this were steamboats. The Union used the Tennessee River as a major supply line, so there was a constant flow of military traffic. As they floated downriver, they came upon something called the Townhead Chute, where the river narrowed sharply and the current grew stronger. If a boat had to sail against this current, they were slowed considerably. This was perfect for Hinson. He would lie in wait, and when a boat chugged into view, he would look down the barrel of his sniper rifle with his cold gray eyes and pick his target. After he pulled the trigger, and his target fell, panic and confusion erupted. Soldiers scrambled, ducking low, searching for the phantom shooter, but they saw nothing. By the time their return fire blasted futilely into the trees, Hinson had already melted away into the thick wilderness. Over weeks, then months, the phantom sniper struck again and again along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Union troops began to feel paranoid, terrified of the ghost in the woods who never missed a shot. He could reach out from half a mile away and pluck a captain or a colonel straight off the deck of a riverboat. Union officers kept records during this time, with estimates suggesting that Hinson may have accounted for well over 100 deaths, despite him being nearly 60 years old during his campaign. But it wasn't just blood that Hinson was after. He wanted to create fear, and he certainly achieved that. Patrols grew twitchy whenever they moved near the rivers, and officers took to ducking for cover at the slightest noise. It was psychological warfare waged by a single man against a whole army, and Jack Hinson was winning. But Hinson's campaign of vengeance did not go unnoticed by the higher-ups. He quickly became a marked man, and orders went over to capture him dead or alive. And yet Hinson remained as elusive as ever. His knowledge of the ridges and river valleys, honed over a lifetime of farming and hunting, gave him unparalleled advantage. Soldiers, outsiders to the land, blundered noisily through the briars and groves. Hinson, meanwhile, just slipped away, leaving no trace but the echo of his rifle. For every officer killed, the Union grew increasingly frustrated, but the longer they failed to find him, the larger his legend grew. This did, however, have an unintended consequence. The Union were already paranoid about bushwhackers, and now, with so many officers dead, they felt more pressure than ever to deal with the problem. They probably had no idea that the increase in guerrilla activity after the fall of 1862 was mainly due to one man, and they launched a disproportionate military campaign to stamp out the bushwhackers once and for all. Mass arrests were made, and more men suspected of being guerrilla fighters were executed. Jack Hinson, despite never being caught with his rifle anywhere near Union soldiers, eventually drew the suspicion of a Union officer posted at the nearby Fort Donelson. The officer sent soldiers to arrest Hinson, but old Jack managed to escape. He took what remained of his family north across the Tennessee River. Confident that they would be safe there, he said his goodbyes and returned back across the river to continue seeking revenge. Many Civil War stories of vengeance end with the capture or death of the guerrilla fighter. That is not how Jack Hinson's story ends. He survived the war and the Union's manhunt. In 1874, nearly a decade after the horrors that created him, the phantom sniper died peacefully in his bed at the age of 67. His rifle, however, remained. It was passed down and preserved, a chilling relic of one man's obsession with revenge. On its muzzle, Hinson scratched 4 linear notches, one for each soldier who killed his sons. Jack Hinson occupies a strange place in American history. He was not a soldier, not enlisted, not bound by the Army's codes. He fought no great battles, commanded no regiments, and never formally donned a uniform, yet his impact lingered across Civil War memory. For the Union forces stationed in Tennessee, he was a nightmare. For Confederate sympathizers, he became a folk hero, the avenger who struck fear into the blue-coated invaders. It may be tempting to view Jack Hinson as some kind of folklore hero, but in reality, he was a more complicated figure. He was a plantation owner who profited directly from slavery before reluctantly letting the people he enslaved go. He was not an ardent defender of the Confederacy, yet he fought Union soldiers with a ferocity rivaling any rebel officer. He did not kill out of patriotic allegiance, but out of personal vendetta.